Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we continue journal collection number 34, and we are up to May 25th of the year 1843. And with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. May 25th. Criticism. It is for the novelist to make no character act absurdly, but only absurdly as seen by the others. The sky is the daily bread of the eyes. What sculpture in these hard clouds, what expression of immense amplitude in this dotted and rippled rack, here firm and continental, there vanishing into plumes and auroral gleams, no crowding, boundless, cheerful, and strong. Men representative. Nothing is dead. Men and things feign themselves dead. The gods are jealous, and their finest gifts of men they deface with some shrewd fault, that we may hate the vessel which holds the nectar. And hence men have in all ages suffered the heralds of heaven to starve and struggle with evils of all kinds. For the gods will not have their heralds amiable, lest men should love the cup and not the nectar. My friends are leaving the town, and I am sad at heart that they cannot have that love and service from me, to which they seem by their aims and the complexion of their minds, and by their unpopularity, to have rich claims. Especially Charles Lane I seem to myself to have treated with the worst inhospitality, inasmuch as I have never received that man to me, not for so much as one moment. A pure, superior, mystical, intellectual, and gentle force, free and youthful too in character, and treating me ever with marked forbearance, he so formidable, a fighter in the ring. Yet he has come, and stayed so long in my neighborhood an alien. For his nature and influence do not invite mine, but always freeze me. It sometimes seems to me strange that English and New Englanders should be so little capable of blending. Their methods and temperaments so differ from ours. They strike 12 the first time. Our people have more than meets the ear. This man seems to me born a warrior and most expert swordsman we have ever seen, good when the trumpet sounds. Metallic in his nature, not vegetable enough. No eye for nature, and his hands as far from his head as Alcott's own. We are not willing to trust the universe to give the hospitality of the omnipresent to the good, but we, too, must assume to do the honors with offices, money, and clatter of plates. O poet, by rock and bird and conferred a new nobility, and not in palaces any longer, would you know the conditions hard but equal? Thou shalt leave the world and know the muse only. Editor's note. This, the concluding passage of The Poet, Essay Second Series, varies, it seems, to the editors for the better and the journal in the following passage. End note. For the time of towns is measured by funeral chimes, and every hour is tolled away from the world, but in nature the merry hours are dialed by the flowers on the hillside, and growth of joy on joy. Thou shalt have a new census and calendar. For a long September day between sun and sun shall hold centuries in its rosy and yellow deeps, and thy calendar shall be thoughts and thy action as thou ought. God wills also that thou abdicate a manifold and duplex life, and a tomb is all that shall be denied thee, for the universe is thy house to live in, and thou shalt not die. If thou keep these laws, thou shalt have a leader's eye, or live always in the mountain, seeing all the details, but seeing them all in their place and tendency, and thou shalt be greeted by omens that are prosperity, and fill thee with light. And thou shalt serve God the terminus, the bounding intellect and love boundary or form, believing that form is an oracle which never lies. And every man shall be to thee for all men, each man being alone in the vast desert, and thou shalt worship him, for he is the universe in a mask. June 10th. Hawthorne and I talked of the number of superior men we have seen. H. said that he had seen several from whom he had expected much, but they had not distinguished themselves, and he had inferred that he must not expect a popular success from such. He had in no wise lost his confidence in their power. I am often refreshed by seeing marks of excellence, and of excellence which makes no impression on people at large, who reckon it a bar-room wit and swaggering intellect not presentable and of no great value. Then I take comfort that these gifts are so cheap, and it would seem that all men are great, only some are adjusted to the delicate mean of this world, and can swim in it wherever put. June 11th. Pride. Pride is so handsome, pride is so economical, pride eradicates so many vices. My Chinese book does not forget to record of Confucius that his nightgown was one length and a half his body. There are some persons from whom we always expect fairy gifts. Let us not cease to expect them. June 18th. Yesterday at Bunker Hill, a prodigious concourse of people, but a village green could not be more peaceful, orderly, sober, and even affectionate. Webster gave us his plain statement like good bread, yet the oration was feeble compared with his other efforts, and even seemed poor and Polonius-like with its indigent conservations. When there is no antagonism, as in these holiday speeches, and no religion, things sound not heroically. It is a poor oration that finds Washington for its highest mark. The audience give one much to observe. They are so light-headed and light-timbered, every man thinking more of his inconveniences than of the objects of the occasion, and the hurrahs are so slight and easily procured. Webster is very good America himself. Wonderful multitudes. On the top of a house I saw a company protecting themselves from the sun by an old large map of the United States. A charitable lumber merchant near the bridge had chalked up over his counting-room door 500 seats for ladies free, and there the 500 sat in their white tiers. The ground within the square at the moment was arranged to hold 80,000 persons. It was evident that there was the monument, and here was Webster, and he knew well that a little more or less of rhetoric signified nothing. He was there as the representative of the American continent, there in his idiomatic capacity, and that is the basis of the satisfaction the people have in hearing him, that he alone of all men does not disappoint the eye and ear, but is a fit figure in the landscape. June 22nd. I was at Brook Farm and had a cheerful time. Some confidences were granted me, and grief softened the somewhat hard nature of Mrs. George Ripley, so that I had never seen her to such advantage. Fine weather, cheerful uplands, and every person you meet is a character, and in free costume. Charles Newcomb I saw, and was relieved to meet again on something of the old footing, after hearing of so much illness and sensitiveness. But Charles is not a person to be seen on a holiday or in holiday places, but one should live in solitude and obscurity, with him for the only person in the county to speak to. Also, George Radford let me a little into the spiritual history and relations that go forward, but one has this feeling in hearing of their spiritualism. Ah, had they never heard of it first, and did not know it was spiritualism. The scholars are the true hierarchy, only that now they are displaced by hypocrites, that is, Sciolists. For is not that the want of the man, to meet a brother who, being fuller of God than he, can hold him steady to a truth until he has made it his own? Oh, with what joy I begin to read a poem which I confide in as an inspiration. Editor's note. Under the ink writing of this page in the journal can be traced the penciled lines, "The Poet," beginning, "But oh, to see his solar eyes, like meteors which chose the way, and rived the dark like a new day," etc., which form the end of the first division of the verses with that title printed in the appendix to the poems. End note. The Chinese are as wonderful for their etiquette as the Hebrews for their piety. Those men who are noised all their lifetime as on the edge of some great discovery never discover anything. But nobody ever heard of Monsieur Daguerre until the daguerreotype appeared, and now I do not know who invented the railroad. Dante's Vita Nuova reads like the book of Genesis, as if written before literature, whilst truth yet existed. A few incidents are sufficient, and are displayed with oriental amplitude and leisure. It is the Bible of love. The Interim. So many things are unsettled which it is of the first importance to settle, and pending their settlement we will do as we do. Variety. Editor's note. Here follows the passage on the successive delights that various authors have given, which is printed in Experience. End note. Perrault si muove. And when at night I look at moon and stars, I seem stationary, and they to hurry. The Three Dimensions. Room, cried the spheres when they first shined, and dived into the ample sky. Room, room, cried the new mankind, and took the oath of liberty. Room, room, willed the opening mind, and found it in variety. Footnote. These verses printed in the Dial were never included by Mr. Emerson in his published poems. Life. Fools and clowns and sots make the fringes of everyone's tapestry of life, and give a certain reality to the picture. What could we do in Concord without Bigelow's and Wesson's barrooms and their dependencies? What without such fixtures as Uncle Sol and old Moore who sleeps in Dr. Hurd's barn and the Red Charity House over the brook? Tragedy and comedy always go hand in hand. Life itself is an interim and a transition. This, O endure, is my 1/20,000th form, and already I feel the old life sprouting underneath in the 20,001st, and I know well that he builds no new world, but tearing down the old for materials. Editor's note. In July, Mr. Emerson, by invitation, gave an address to the Temperance Society at Harvard, Massachusetts. The extract which Mr. Cabot gives in the appendix to his memoir shows that he treated his subject largely and by no means in the usual narrow and specific way. End note. July 8th. The sun and the evening sky do not look calmer than Alcott and his family at Fruitlands. They seem to have arrived at that fact, to have got rid of the show, and so to be serene. Their manners and behavior in the house and in the field were those of superior men, of men at rest. What had they to conceal? What had they to exhibit? And it seemed so high an attainment that I thought as often before, so now more, because they had a fit home, or the picture was fitly framed, that these men ought to be maintained in their place by the country for its culture. Young men and young maidens, old men and women, should visit them and be inspired. I think there is as much merit in beautiful manners as in hard work. I will not prejudge them successful. They look well in July. We will see them in December. I know they are better for themselves than as partners. One can easily see that they have yet to settle several things. Their saying that things are clear, and they saying, does not make them so. If they will in every deed be lovers and not selfish, if they will serve the town of Harvard and make their neighbors feel them as benefactors whenever they touch them, they are as safe as the sun. We spend our money for that which is not help, and have the inconvenience of the reputation of money without its advantage. Those who have no appearance to keep up, the dowdy farmer's wife who meets you at her door, broom in hand, or pauses at her washtub to answer your question, their house is serene and majestic, if their natures are, but ours is not, let our ideas be what they may, whilst we may not appear except in costume, and our immunity at the same time is bought by money and not by love and nature. And far away the purple morn, concealed by intervening fruits and flowers, lies buried in the abundance of the hours. July 10th. Ellery Channing railed an hour in good set terms at the usurpation of the past, at the great hoaxes of the Homers and Shakespeares, hindering the books and the men of today of their just meed. Oh, certainly. I assure him that oaks and horse chestnuts are entirely obsolete, that the Horticultural Society are about to recommend the introduction of cabbages as a shade tree, so much more convenient and every way comprehensible, all grown from the seed upward to its most generous crumpled extremity within one's own short memory, past contradiction the ornament of the world, and then so good to eat as acorns and horse chestnuts are not. Shade trees for breakfast. Then this whole business of one man taking the praise of all or more than his share of the praise. As all are alike in nature and possibility, it is absurd that any should pretend to exhibit more reason or virtue than I do. A man of genius, did you say? A man of virtue? I tell you both are malformations, painful inflammations of the brain and of the liver, and such shall be punishable in the new commonwealth. And if any such appear, they shall be dealt with as reasonable Spartans and Indians do with lame and deformed infants, toss them into the river, and the average of the race improved. Nothing that is not extempore shall now be tolerated. Pyramids and cities shall give place to tents. The man, the skeleton and body, which many years have built up, shall go for nothing. His dinner, the mutton and rice he ate 2 hours ago, now fast flowing into chyle, that is all we consider, and the problem now to detach new dinner from old man, we respect from what we scorn, deserves the study of the scientific. Editor's note: the poem Blight follows. End note. The clergy are the etiquette or Chinese empire of our American society. They are here that we may not be fed and bedded and die and be buried as dogs, but in the want of dignity we may be treated to a sufficiency of parade and gentle gradations of salutation at coming and parting. If anybody dies and grieves us to the heart, so that the people might be melted to tears by a hearty word, the minister shuts his lips and preaches on the miracles or the parables or Solomon's temple, because the family have not had up their note. If any new outrage on law or any pregnant event fills the mind of people with queries and omens, the pulpit is dumb. Ellery, who hopes there will be no cows in heaven, has discovered that cows are for, namely, to give the farmer something to do in summertime. All this haying comes at midsummer between planting and harvest, when all hands would be idle, but for this cow and ox, which must be fed and mowed for, and thus intemperance and the progress of crime is prevented. July 16th. Montaigne has the de quoi which the French cherubs had not, when the courteous archbishop implored them to sit down. His reading was Plutarch. 'Tis high time we had a Bible that should be no provincial record, but should open the history of the planet, and bind all tendencies, and dwarf all the epics and philosophies we have. It will have no books of Ruth and Esther, no Song of Solomon, nor excellent sophistical Pauls. As if any taste or imagination could supply identity, the old duty is the old God. Readiness is youthfulness. To hold the old world in our hand, awaiting our new errand, and to be rebuked by a child, by a sot, by a Philistine, and thankfully take a new course. The moral sentiment is well called the newness, for it is never other than a surprise, and the oldest angels are the boys whom it doth whip and scourge, though its scars give the gladness of the martyr flame. I have got in my barn a carpenter's bench, and 2 planes, a shave, a saw, a chisel, a vise, and a square. These planes seem to me great institutions, whose inventor no man knoweth, yet what a stroke of genius was each of these tools. When you have them, you must watch a workman for a month, or a year, or 7 years, as our boys do, to know all his tricks with them. Great is Tubal Cain. A good pen is a finer, stronger instrument, and a language and algebra, a calculus, music, or poetic meter, more wondrous tools yet, for this polygon or pentagon that is called man. Thanks, too, to Pythagoras for the multiplication table. To lay down the heavy burden of herself as woman would. August 5th. Home from Plymouth, where I spent a fine day in an excursion to Halfway Pond, dining at the house of Mrs. R. Mary and Lucia Russell made the party for us, and Abraham Jackson and Helen Russell accompanied us. Mrs. R. was a genuine Yankee, and so fluent in her provincial English that Walter Scott or Dickens could not desire a better sample of local life. Mr. Faunce, Mr. Swift, and Mr. Stetson, her ministers at Ponds, meaning Monument Ponds, baptism by immersion and by sprinkling, Mr. Whitfield's sermons, the Universalers, the schools, and the reformation of the church at Ponds and elsewhere, and the drowning of her son Alan in a vessel loaded with paving stones which sunk in a tempest near Boston Light, and the marriage of her son's widow, were the principal events of her life and the topics of her conversation. She lives alone in this pleasing, tranquil scene at the head of a pond, and never is uneasy except in a tempest in the night. I cannot well say what I found at Plymouth beyond the uneasiness of seeing people. Every person of worth, man or woman, whom I see, gives me a pain, as if I injured them, because of my incapacity to do them justice in the intercourse that passes between us. Two or more persons together deoxygenate the air, apathize and paralyze me. I twist like the poor eel in the exhausted receiver, and my conviction of their sense and virtue only makes matters worse for me by accusing my injustice. I am made for chronic relations, not for moments, and am wretched with fine people who are only there for an hour. It is a town of great local and social advantages, Plymouth, lying on the sea with this fine broken inland country, pine-covered and scooped into beds of 200 lakes. Their proverb is that there is a pond in Plymouth for every day of the year. Billington Sea is the best of all, and yet this superb chain of lakes which we pass in returning from Halfway Pond might content one 100 years. The botany of the region is rare. The epigea named Mayflower at Plymouth is now found elsewhere. The beautiful and fragrant sabbatia, the epterum, the sundew, the rhinothus and yellow rattle, and other plants are almost peculiar to this spot. Great linden trees lift their green domes above the town as seen from the sea, and the graveyard hill shows the monuments of the pilgrims and their children as far out to sea as we could see anything of the town. The virtues of the Russells are as eminent and fragrant here at this moment as ever were the glories of that name in England. And L is a flower of the sweetest and softest beauty which real life ever exhibited. These people know so well how to live, and have such perfect adjustment in their tastes and their power to gratify them, that the ideal life is necessarily thrown into the shade, and I have never seen a strong conservatism appear so amiable and wise. We saw their well-built houses, which an equal and generous economy warmed and animated, and their good neighborhood was never surpassed. The use of the doorbell and knocker seems unknown, and the fine children who played in the yards and piazzas appeared to come of a more amiable and gentle stock. Editor's note: Concord was, until about 1852, a shire town, and the courts, later transferred to Lowell, were held there. In the summer of 1843, a somewhat notable case, Commonwealth versus Wyman, from the eminence of the counsel employed, was tried there, an officer of a Charleston bank having been charged with misappropriation of its funds. Several passages of this entry were used by Mr. Emerson in 1854 in his address in New York on, quote, "the fugitive slave law," but it seemed best to keep them here, not to interrupt the continuity of the text. See Miscellanies, pages 222 and 223. August 17th. Webster at Concord. Mr. Webster loses nothing by comparison with brilliant men in the legal profession. He is as much before them as before the ordinary lawyer. At least I thought he appeared among these best lawyers of the Suffolk bar, like a schoolmaster among his boys. His wonderful organization, the perfection of his elocution, and all that hereto belongs, voice, accent, intonation, attitude, manner, are such as one cannot hope to see again in a century. Then he is so thoroughly simple and wise in his rhetoric. Understanding language and the use of the positive degree, all his words tell, and his rhetoric is perfect, so homely, so fit, so strong. Then he manages his matter so well, he hugs his facts so close, and will not let it go, and never indulges in a weak flourish, though he knows perfectly well how to make such exordiums and episodes and perorations as may give perspective to his harangue, without in the least embarrassing his plan of confounding his transitions. What is small, he shows as small, and makes the great great. In speech he sometimes roars, and his words are like blows of an axe. His force of personal attack is terrible. He lays out his strength so directly in honest blows, and all his powers of voice, arm, eye, and whole man are so heartily united and bestowed on the adversary that he cannot fail to be felt. His Christian religion is always weak, being merely popular, and so most of his religion. Thus he spoke of the value of character. It was simply mercantile. It was to defend a man in criminal prosecutions and the like, and bear him up against the inspection of all but the Almighty, etc. And in describing Wyman's character, he said he wanted that sternness of Christian principle which teaches to, avoid even the appearance of evil, and one feels every moment that he goes for the actual world, and never one moment for the ideal. He is the triumph of the understanding, and is undermined and supplanted by the reason, for which yet he is so good a witness, being all the time fed therefrom, and his whole nature and faculty, presupposing that I felt as if the children of reason might gladly see his success as an homage to their law, and regard him as a poor, rude soldier hired for sixpence a day to fight their battles. I looked at him sometimes with the same feeling with which I see one of these strong patties on the railroad. Perhaps it was this, perhaps it was a mark of having outlived some of my once finest pleasures, that I found no appetite to return to the court in the afternoon and hear the conclusion of his argument. The green fields on my way home were too fresh and fair, and forbade me to go again. His splendid wrath, when his eyes became fires, is as good to see, so intellectual it is, and the wrath of the fact and cause he espouses, and not at all personal to himself. Rockwood Horror said nothing amused him more than to see Mr. Webster adjourn the court every day, which he did by rising and taking his hat and looking the judge coolly in the face, who then bade the crier adjourn the court. Choate and Webster. Rufus Choate is a favorite with the bar, and a nervous, fluent speaker, with a little too much fire for the occasion, yet with a certain temperance in his fury and a perfect self-command. But he uses the superlative degree, and speaks of affairs altogether too rhetorically. This property of $300,000, the property of a bank, he speaks of as vast, and quite academically, and there was no perspective in his speech. The transitions were too slight and sudden. But the cast-iron tones of the man of men, the perfect machine that he is for arguing a case, dwarfed instantly Choate and all the rest of the learned counselors. Webster behaves admirably well in society. These village parties must be dishwater to him, yet he shows himself just as good-natured, just nonchalant enough, and has his own way without offending anyone or losing any ground. He told us that he never read by candlelight. Judge Allen told me last night that he had great and increasing confidence in juries, and thought that in 9 cases out of 10 they rendered a satisfactory and a right verdict. He appealed to Mr. Hoare, who thought this true in 5 cases out of 6. Quote, Sir Walter Raleigh was such a person every way, that, as King Charles I says of the Lord Strafford, a prince would rather be afraid of than ashamed of. He had that awfulness and ascendancy in his aspect over other mortals, that the king, and here Aubrey's manuscript stops. Webster quite fills our little town, and I doubt if I shall get settled down to writing until he is well gone from the county. He is a natural emperor of men. They remark in him the kingly talent of remembering persons accurately, and knowing at once to whom he has been introduced and to whom not. He has lately bought his father's farm in Franklin, formerly Salisbury, New Hampshire, as Waller the poet wished to buy his birthplace, Winchmore Hill, saying to his cousin Hampden, "A stag, when he is hunted and near spent, always returns home." Elizabeth Hoare says that she talked with him as one likes to go behind the Niagara Falls, so she tried to look into those famed caverns of eyes and see how deep they were, and the whole man was magnificent. Mr. Choate told her that he should not sleep for a week when a cause like this was pending, but that when they met in Boston on Saturday afternoon to talk over the matter, the rest of them were wide awake, but Mr. Webster went fast asleep amidst the consultation. It seems to me the quixotism of criticism to quarrel with Webster because he has not this or that fine evangelical property. He is no saint, but the wild olive wood, ungrafted, yet by grace, but according to his lights, a very true and admirable man. His expensiveness seems to be necessary to him. Were he too prudent a Yankee, it would be a sad deduction from his magnificence. I only wish he would never truckle. I do not care how much he spends. Webster's force is part of nature, and the world like any given amount of azote or electricity. After all his great talents have been told, there remains that perfect propriety which belongs to every world genius, which animates all the details of action and speech with the character of the whole, so that his beauties of detail are endless. Great is life. I cannot consent to compare him, Webster, with his competitors, but when the Clay men and Van Buren men and the Calhoun men have had all their way, and all their political objections have been conceded, and they have settled their little man, whichever it be, on the top of the martin box of state, then, and not before, we will begin to state the claims of this world's man, this strong Paddy of the times and law and state, to his place in history. Nature. In nature, the doubt occurs whether the man is the cause or the effect. Are beasts and plants degradations of man, or are these prophecies and preparations of nature practicing herself for her masterpiece in man? Culminate we do not, but that point of imperfection which we occupy, is it on the way up or down? Again, is the world, according to the old doubt, to be criticized otherwise than as the best possible in the existing system, and the population of the world the best that soils, climates, and animals permit? Will is the measure of power. Proclus on Timaeus. Prudence is a medium between intellect and opinion. Proclus. Intellect is that by which we know terms or boundaries. Aristotle. Beauty swims on the light of forms. Proclus. Intellect, according to the Amelius, is threefold: that which is, that which has, and that which sees. Proclus. Law is the distribution of intellect. Proclus. Every soul pays a guardian attention to that which is inanimate. Plato in Phaedrus. It is a pathetic thing to meet a friend prepared to love you, to whom yet, from some inaptitude, you cannot communicate yourself with that grace and power which only love will allow. You wish to repay his goodness by showing him the clear relations that subsist between you and your chosen friends, but you feel that he cannot conceive of you whom he knows so slow and cold under these sweet and gentle aspects. Confide in your power, whether it be to be a wet nurse or a wood sawyer, lion taming Van Amberg, or Stewart, maker of steam candy. Keep your shop, magnify your office. Fear smears our work, and ignorance gilds our neighbors, but the sure years punish our faint-heartedness. Editor's note. Here follow many extracts from the She King, the third member of the Pentateuch of most ancient Chinese classics. A few are here given. End note. The way of Chow is even as a whetstone and as straight as an arrow. Superior men tread in it, and inferior men view it as their pattern. Sorry, sorry is my heart, I am hated by the low herd. He who neither errs nor forgets is the man who accords with the ancient canons. Let the rain descend first on our public and then on our private fields. End of Chinese quotations. Apparent imitations of unapparent natures. Footnote: the first motto comes from the so-called Chaldean oracles. Mr. Emerson quotes Thomas Taylor as saying that these were either delivered by theurgists under the reign of Marcus Antoninus or by Zoroaster. The book that shall win its way ought to have genius. Marshall. I wish to speak with all respect of persons, but sometimes I find it needs much heedfulness to preserve the due decorum, they melt so fast into each other. August 25th. The railroad whose building I inspected this afternoon brings a multitude of picturesque traits into our pastoral scenery. There is nothing in history to parallel the influence of Jesus Christ. The Chinese books say of Wan Wang, one of their kings, quote, "From the west, from the east, from the south, and from the north, there was not one thought not brought in subjection to him." End quote. This can be more truly said of Jesus than of any mortal. Mencia says, quote, "A sage is the instructor of 100 ages. When the manners of Pai Yi are heard of, the stupid become intelligent, and the wavering determined." End quote. Fourier carries a whole French Revolution in his head, and much more. This is arithmetic with a vengeance. In the points of good breeding, what I most require and insist upon is deference. I like that every chair should be a throne and hold a king. And what I most dislike is a low sympathy of each with his neighbor's palate. I respect cats, they seem to have so much else in their heads besides their mess. I prefer a tendency to stateliness to an excess of fellowship. In all things I would have the island of a man inviolate. No degree of affection is to invade this religion. The charge which a lady in much trust made to me against her companions was that people on whom beforehand all persons would put the utmost reliance were not responsible. They saw the necessity that the work must be done, and did it not. And it of course fell to be done by herself and the few principals. I replied that in my experience good people were as bad as rogues, that the conscience of the conscientious ran in veins, and the most punctilious in some particulars were latitudinarian in others. Henry Thoreau sends me a paper with the old fault of unlimited contradiction. The trick of his rhetoric is soon learned. It consists in substituting for the obvious word and thought its diametrical antagonist. He praises wild mountains and winter forests for their domestic air, snow and ice for their warmth, villagers and woodchoppers for their urbanity, and the wilderness for resembling Rome and Paris. With a constant inclination to dispraise cities and civilization, he yet can find no way to know woods and woodsmen except by paralleling them with towns and townsmen. Channing declared the piece is excellent, but it makes me nervous and wretched to read it, with all its merits. The thinker looks for God in the direction of the consciousness, the churchman out of it. If you ask the former for his definition of God, he would answer, "My possibility." For his definition of man, "My actuality." Quote, "Stand up straight," said the stage coachman, "and the rain won't wet you a mite." We like the strong objectiveness of Homer and of the primitive poems of each country, ballads, and the Chinese and Indian sentences, but that cannot be preserved in a large and civilized population. The scholar will inevitably be detached from the mechanic and will not dwell in the same house, nor see his handiwork so nearby, and must adopt new classification and a more metaphysical vocabulary. Hawthorne boasts that he lived at Brook Farm during its heroic age. Then all were intimate, and each knew the other's work. Priest and cook conversed at night of the day's work. Now they complain that they are separated, and such intimacy cannot be. There are 100 souls. It seems as if we had abundance of insight and a great taste for writing in this country, only the describers wanted subjects. But that is deceptive. The great describer is known hereby, that he finds topics. The farmer whom I visited this afternoon works very hard and very skillfully to get a good estate, and gets it. But by his skill and diligence, and that of thousands more, his competitors, the wheat and milk by which I live are made so cheap that they are within reach of my scanty moneys, and I am not yet forced to go to work and produce them for myself. Tuttle told me once that he had carried 4,100 weight of hay to Boston, and received $61.50 for the load. But it is no part of T's design to keep down the price of hay or wheat or milk. How long shalt thou stay, thou devastator of thy friend's day? Each substance and relation in nature's operation hath its unit and meter. And the new compounds are multiples of that. But the unit of the visit or the meeting of friends is the meeting of their eyes. The founders of Brook Farm ought to have this praise, that they have made what all people try to make, an agreeable place to live in. All comers and the most fastidious find it the pleasantest of residences. If you look at these railroad laborers and hear their stories, their fortunes appear as little controlled as those of the forest leaves. One is whirled off to Albany, one to Ohio, one digs on the levee at New Orleans, and one at Walden Pond. Others on their wharves in Boston or the woods in Maine, and they have too little foresight and too little money to leave them any more election of whither to go or what to do than the poor leaf which is blown into the dike or that brook to perish. Quote, to work from dark to dark for 50 cents the day, as the poor woman in the shanty told us, is but pitiful wages for a married man. Few people know how to spend a large fortune. A beauty of wealth is power without pretension, a despotism under the quietest speech, and under the plainest garb neither rich nor poor. The money lord should have no fine furniture or fine equipage, but should open all doors, be warm, be cool, ride, fly, execute, or suspend execution at his will, and see what he willed come to pass. Ellery's poetry shows the art, though the poems are imperfect, as the first Daguerre's are grim things, yet show that a great engine has been invented. Superiority of Vathek over Vivian Grey. Is life a thunderstorm that we can now see by a flash the whole horizon and then cannot see our right hand? Families should be formed on a higher method than by the intelligence office. A man will come to think it as absurd to send thither for his nurse or farmer as for a wife. Domestics pass in silence through the social rooms and recover their tongues at the kitchen door. To bless you? This is the end of Part 3 of Emerson's Journal Collection number 34. In the next video, we will take up where we left off with the entry for September 3rd, and that will be the last video in Journal Collection 34. Thank you for listening.